Happy Monday and welcome to another Live with Kevin. I'm so glad that you're here, whether you're here with me live or here with me later. Either one, I'm glad that you're with us. And if you're with us live, what I'd love for you to do is to say hello and tell me where you're located by using the chat or comment function in whatever social channel you happen to be watching from. If you do that, that would be great. When you do that, it helps my guests to know a little bit more about who's here. But there's another reason I want you to do that, because I want you to get comfortable with using that keyboard over the next 30 minutes or so, because I want you to imagine you're joining my guest and I for around a table having a cup of coffee. And if you were doing that and you had a question, you would ask it. If you had a comment, you would share it. If you had an idea, you would offer it. You would just do that naturally. So even though you're not around the table, heck, I'm not even at the same table as my guest, you can do that virtually. You can do that by using the comment or chat function on your favorite social channel where you're at now. And by doing that, we'll have a better conversation. Your question might make the actual conversation itself, but it will also, regardless, it'll help guide me in what I ask and the conversation that we have. So I hope that you'll do that. So now what I'm going to, if you didn't know already, this will eventually also be an episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. You see it there over my shoulder. So now I'm going to do the opening to that for when that comes out in October. So Marissa, this is for you in 3, 2, 1. There are roadblocks in the way of most any kind of progress. If we are thinking about our progress and effectiveness as a leader, one of those roadblocks are things we can't even see. In other words, our blind spots. Today, we're talking about what we can't see, our blind spots, and how we can better understand them and overcome them on our path to greater success. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger positive difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you are listening to this podcast, you could join us live in the future on your favorite social platform. You can find out when those live episodes are happening and therefore get connected, get access to this information sooner. You can join our groups on either Facebook or LinkedIn as a way to do that. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. That's how you can make that happen. Today's episode is brought to you by my latest book, Flexible Leadership, Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. It's time to realize that styles can get in our way and that following our strengths might not always be the best approach. In a world more complex and uncertain than ever, leaders need a new perspective, a new set of tools to help them create the great results their teams and organizations need. That's what Flexible Leadership provides you when you have a copy. Learn more and get your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/flexible. And with that, I'm going to bring in my guest. His name is Marty Dubin. I'm going to introduce him. His book says his name is Martin. He said, call him Marty. He's a clinical psychologist turned serial entrepreneur. He's a business coach and a trusted advisor to C-suite leaders and Silicon Valley founders. He built and led a multi-million-dollar healthcare company, later acquired by Anthem, and has worked with top executives from Fortune 500 companies and major VC-backed startups. With a doctorate in psychology and deep business experience, Martin helps leaders uncover blind spots and unlock personal and professional growth. He's also held faculty roles at the Center for Creative Leadership and the University of Denver. He has unpacked his work and wisdom in his new book, Blind Spotting: How to See What's Holding You Back. He splits his time between Colorado and New Mexico, where he enjoys skiing, hiking, and coaching leaders around the world. And now he's our guest. We're talking about the book is brand new right now, Marty. Thanks for joining me and welcome.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm looking forward to the conversation, Kevin.
I mean, I don't know when anyone else is going to be listening to this or watching this later, but as we're having this conversation, the book is less than a week old, which is a super exciting time for any author. And so I'm super happy to have you with me. So let's start here. I'm guessing, Marty, when you were, 10 years old, you weren't thinking you were going to become a clinical psychologist or entrepreneur. Like, how do you end up doing this kind? So maybe first of all, tell me if I'm wrong on that assumption, and then second of all, sort of what sort of leads you on the path to doing the work that you're doing today.
Well, you're absolutely right about it wasn't in my head. Actually, if you look at my initials, my father was a physician, and I think with the initials of MD, I think that was supposed to be my life course, but it deviated. Yeah, I got curious in college about myself and everybody else, as many people do, and so I followed psychology and I don't know about you, but my career has taken a number of interesting turns, and I only realized I was on a different path when I looked back and say, "Oh, there was a fork in the road back there." Um, and the book just grew out of the fact that I've had this unusual career, treating patients, then running a company, and then coaching. And during COVID, actually, I just sat down and started to put my thoughts together. Like, why did I tell people what I told them? How do I really think about what makes people tick and how to help people change? And so that's what resulted in the book.
So let's talk about that then, about this book a little bit. It's called, again, it's called, everybody, it's called Blind Spotting: How to See What's Holding You Back as a Leader. There's lots been written and studied, and you probably know this far better than I, that we as humans think we're more self-aware than we actually are. So why don't you talk about that, agree or disagree, and then take us into the idea behind blind spotting.
Sure. Yeah. We are aware of ourselves, but we're not aware of ourselves completely. And we act on default responses, that if we had to think about everything that we were doing all the time, we'd never get anything done. So we act on automatic, and that's kind of how we're built as organisms. We have pattern recognition, we have successful experiences, and that we learn, aha, that's the way to respond in certain kinds of situations. And so blind spotting, mostly I worked with successful leaders. And the blind spotting is for that 5 or 10% when you're messing up. And it's when those automatic responses that are successful for you most of the time, that fit the situations that you're in and bring you success, aren't working. And you're just not aware of it because you are doing what you normally do, what feels right to you. You mentioned in your book about overusing strengths, and that's a very big chapter in my book. So that's an obvious one where people use their strengths and it works for them most of the time, but there are times when it doesn't.
So we'll sort of finish with like how do we find them, how do we see them, and all that sort of thing. I mean, obviously that's the payoff here, but I want to talk a little bit about the model
Yes.
that you created, and we'll have a chance to talk about the types of blind spots. But just talk a little bit about the model, how you came to the model, and how it's instructive in the big picture before we get into some details.
Yeah, thank you. So the model is a self-awareness model, and there's actually a diagram in the book, and I'll try to get you to visualize the diagram as I talk about it here. And the hardest part of the book was figuring out the diagram. I figured out the 6 areas that I wanted people to think about. And it's when I think about what I used in my psychotherapy practice and in my coaching. And so the 6 areas are our behavior, our identity, our intellect, our emotion, our traits, and our motives. And it's for me, it's a complete way of looking at people. The most common way, especially in business, people look at leaders is about traits. So traits is one of the pieces in here, but we're really much more complex than that. And to visualize the model, you can almost visualize like a target, like an archery target or something. And the outer ring is what we're most aware of, what we can access pretty clearly, and that's our identity and our behavior. I mean, we just see how we behave. We're pretty aware of that. Our identity are kind of the name tags we wear. I am a father, a son, a husband, a psychologist, whatever the different those things are. So those 2 are pretty aware. The next ring in has 3 pieces: our traits, our emotions, and our intellect. And we have some access to that. And one more point on that outer ring, because we're most aware, we're most able to change it. This middle ring are pretty hardwired. Our intellect, our traits, our emotions, those are pretty hardwired by the time we're adults. But they show up in our behaviors and our identities, so we can change them by changing how they show up. And then in the core center of the bullseye, if you will, is our motives. That's kind of the engine of our system. That's what pushes us, drives us to do things. And it's often the thing we're least aware of in a complex way. So some of what I did, certainly as a psychotherapist and as a coach, was help people uncover what are the motives that are really driving them, that show up through all those other rings of the model.
So I want to start with identity. It's the chapter you start with in the book once you get rolling. And the reason I want to start there is because I mentioned my book, Flexible Leadership, and I find that one of the big challenges that people have about to be able to be flexible is that they've locked into their identity. This is who I am. This is how I lead. So I'd love for you to say more about. Let's talk more about that identity. Like, how does it form? And I think more importantly, how can we? I use the word change, you use the word evolve. How can we evolve our identity or reframe our identity? Let's talk about that, because I think it is such a it's such a big challenge. Like you already said, we live and work on auto response habits, which are hard enough to change. I think identity is even harder to change.
Yeah,
So
you and I are on the same page there. Yeah. So some of our identity, happens very early. Society kind of tells us, our family tells us, you're good at this, you're good at that, you're this type of person. People in our family do it this way. So we begin to develop our identity. Some of our identities are those actual roles that you study to be an engineer, and so being an engineer is your identity. Or your identity is to be a rule breaker or rebellious or a rule follower. So all these kinds of things become our identities. When they become they mostly work for us. When they are blind spots is when I look at it in terms of when our role changes and our identity doesn't catch up with our new role. And I really became aware of this when I was working with entrepreneurs and having been one myself. I kind of, in a broad sense, I think of three roles with the entrepreneurs. One is that they start out as an innovator. They're doing something new. It's never been done before. They're creative. They're curious. They're pushing things beyond the boundaries. And that's what excites them, and that's how they identify who they are. But at some point, the product starts to catch traction and they start to have a business. Then they need to actually become a business builder, learn about legal and regulatory and marketing and all these other things, and start to give up that identity that they really loved. And some don't, and some actually exit as founders, or they stay a founder, but they exit as CEO. And then the final shift is to become a leader. Once the business really got traction and is building and is profitable and everything, then they need to really be leading other people. And at every one of those changes, if you're actually making the change, there should be some grief. I mean, you loved that previous identity. It felt good for you. And so if you have to let go of it and get a new one, you should actually be feeling some sense of loss. And if you don't, then that might be a little bit of a flag. And it's the same in regular business. People start out as individual contributors, they become managers, then they become managers of managers, and then leaders of managers. Each of those transitions, if you rise in a hierarchy, you need to look and make sure your identity and your role are well aligned.
You mention a word in the book related to that, and it's a topic we've talked about a number of times over the years on the show, is the idea of feeling like we're an imposter. And when you think about that, when you think about those transitions, whether it's from individual contributor to frontline leader, whether it's, as the stages of the evolution of your business, as you described earlier, whatever that might be, my identity is that I'm an imposter. People are going to figure me out. I really don't have this figured out. Like, what's your take on that? There's been a lot written and talked about that, but I'm curious specifically about what your take is on that.
Yeah, I think I think most of us feel that at some point. There's somewhat of I'm making it up till I figure it out, and you kind of, especially when you're moving into a new role or a broader responsibility. Um, so, I mean, I think it can be transitory about that sense of imposter. And once you start to feel confident and you start to get some success in your new role, then you can kind of let go of it. I think it does really trip some people up, and it becomes something they hold on to throughout their life. And it is an identity. It is actually, if you strip things back, that's one of the name tags they wear deep inside is somebody's going to find out. So that requires a little more work with people where it's become kind of an identity that's been stuck, to try to help them get beyond that.
But I think what you said first is really helpful to the majority of us, which is it's natural for you to feel that in a transitory way. And so correct me if what I'm going to say
Yeah.
next is incorrect, but don't be aware of it. Don't let it be a blind spot. But that feeling, that recognize it could very well be transitory. And so don't make it something it's not. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's really, and it's quite frankly, that's true of a lot of things in psychopathology. And some people go through changes and they get so caught up in it and they dig themselves a hole around it. And then it's really hard to change. Anxiety disorders kind of often emerge that kind of way. So yeah, catching those things early and having a good talk with yourself, or having your friends and family support you and get you to move beyond it, is really helpful.
So in that so the outside ring is identity and behaviors. I want to go to that next ring,
Sure.
which is intellect, emotion, and traits. And so let's talk about intellect. How specifically for us as leaders, how does what are some of the common blind spots you see around intellect, and what can we do to better understand ourselves around this area?
Yeah, this is probably the most experimental chapter, if you will, in my book. I would love, actually, I mean, I hope my book sparks some PhD dissertations and people, can prove out or disprove some of the things in the book. But as a psychologist, my profession is probably the most guilty of fetishizing IQ. And the smarter you are, the better you are. That kind of a concept. And I can't tell you how many times people had told me, "Oh, wait till you meet this person. They're wicked smart," which is a weird term to begin with anyway. But I certainly saw so many super bright people. At some point their intellect actually was getting in the way. And so I started thinking seeing successful people, leaders that were, bright, but not the brightest bulb in the room. And so how did they become so successful, and how do they make better decisions? And so I think about four types of intelligence. That first one is the horsepower, that IQ kind of a thing, which certainly is important. Some people the next one I call processing speed. Some people are just fast on the fly, and that's really important in business and in life. In a lot of situations, you just need to figure it out right then and make a decision and do that, versus I need to think about it for a while and go back and pull out a spreadsheet. The third group is creativity. These are the people that see the unseen connections that just don't seem obvious to the rest of us, and often seem like a distraction sometimes in meetings, till you think about it and you think, "Oh, wait a minute, what are they talking about?" And an astute leader puts together people with all these different kinds of intelligences, in my mind, and so knows that they've got that creative one in the room, and they listen for those ideas and make sure that they get the light of day, because sometimes those are
They
the
get
ones.
held on to so we don't lose them, right?
Exactly. And then the fourth is a little bit of a catch-all. I call it street smarts, kinds of business acumen, head on a pivot. These are people that are noticing things all the time, all around, and really have these are often the best negotiators, because they really can kind of get the emotional, it's part of its EQ, I think, the emotional piece, as well as all the data. Anyway, blind spots are when you're over-indexing on one type of intellect and not another. It's a rare person that is high in all four of those. Um, but if you know where you are high and where you might be a little bit low in those different types, then you surround yourself with people that help complement you. And because it's all about making the best decision and the best judgment as a team.
I'm going to go off the rails here a little bit. I'm going to, as you were sharing that, I was thinking about an experience I had like 3 days ago. So just a couple of days
Perfect.
ago, I celebrated my 45th high school class reunion. So yes, everyone who's watching or listening can do the math. And if you couldn't figure out how old I was by looking at the color of my hair, now you got a better clue. But I was at my class reunion, and you said that so often we over-index on IQ, and the way we would match that up in school, right or wrong, would
Right.
be grades, right? And I have always enjoyed my class reunions, and I think I enjoy them even more the older we all get, because you can think about how people have what they've done in their lives, and you can say, well, I wouldn't have thought they would have because of maybe he
Right.
didn't have the grades, or why didn't they? Because he has the grades. And I think putting these four things together is part of that. And as I was listening, because that's the prisoner of the moment, recency bias, right? I was thinking about people that I interacted with and that I know, or that I know more about their life trajectories. And it's an interesting way. It's easier often for us to think about that in terms of others than ourselves.
Right. Yeah, I've had the exact same experience. People that I grew up with, and it's like, whoa, they were just like an average student, and they just blew the socks off of everybody else. And what was it about them that kind of made that happen? And the book is about self-awareness. That's, if I was going to describe the book in one word, that's what the book is about. And so with this intellect piece, as with all these others, it's getting to know who you are. No judgment, just getting to know who you are. That is who you are and what you're good at, and being able to figure out where your strengths are going to work well for you, and where you need some help, or you need to kind of watch yourself so that you can kind of get into trouble.
So let's talk about that strengths thing. It falls into the traits part of your model, but it really sort of fits in all parts of your model in a way.
Right.
And so talk about your thoughts. That word's come up several times already. What are your thoughts about strengths, understanding them, being careful about them, et cetera? Like, share your thoughts here.
Yeah. So this was actually the aha that probably started the book in many ways. One of the things that I do as a business coach that's very common is you do with what's called a 360. I interview everybody that works around and with the individual. And, there's lots of ways to do it, but it often falls into, two major buckets. What are the strengths and what are the opportunities for improvement?
Mm-hmm.
And I tended to think of that when I started to do that as just two separate buckets, and the strengths were interesting, but the person always wanted to say, well, where can I improve? Let's talk about where people, what people didn't like about me. And we'd go there. And then I realized they weren't always the same words, but often the flip side of the strength was what people were talking about. They would talk about the person being arrogant or distractible. Arrogant was a flip side of confidence. Distractible was a flip side of being overly curious. And I realized that that's what was coming out. And it was an easier thing for the leader to get a hold of when I started saying, let's look at this, as you as a whole. And these are really when you're overusing your strengths. And so one way for all of us to get an idea about this is think about the things that you really think are your strengths, or that people tell you that are your strengths. And then add the modifier TOO in front of it. What happens when you're too social? What happens when you're too confident? What happens when you're too creative? When you're too organized? And those are probably the things that your partner, your spouse, or your friends talk to you about. Hey, you're too X.
Or don't talk to you about, but talk to each other about.
People want to talk to you about it, right?
Would like to talk to you about, right? That's exactly right. A strength overused, right, becomes
Yes.
a weakness. And to your point, the point of this book, strength overused often is the blind spot.
Yes. Right? And we are always a mixture of who we are and the situation we're in. So your strength works in 90% of the situations you're in, say, but there are those 10% of the situations that you're in where it does not work, when it would be better if you were less social, when it would be better if you were less confident. Um, and do you know when those situations are happening so that you can adjust? The book is about we are the instrument. Our our personality is the instrument for whatever kind of leadership we're going to express. The more we know about ourselves, the more strategic we can be about how we deploy ourselves. So that's what this book's really about.
If you missed the beginning and you like what you just heard, you need to make sure you get a copy of Blind Spotting: How to See What's Holding You Back as a Leader. And of course, you added the as a leader at the end because the examples in the book, that's the context. And yet the book applies without the last three
Right.
words. Agreed? You want to say anything about that? You
No,
want to
that
say anything
was
about this leader versus everybody else, or even leader hat on, leader hat off? Any comment about all that?
yeah, I love that you brought that up, Kevin. I appreciate that. My publisher is Harvard Business Review Press, so it obviously they put that part as a leader, and it could be as a teacher, it could be as a parent, it could be just as a human being. Absolutely.
And again, I think that if you can read when you're reading the book, if you can read past the examples and don't say, "Oh, well, this is only a book for leaders," but just continue to read the concept and read the ideas, I think it's completely, to your point, applicable across. I'm glad that we had the chance to talk about that. Is there anything else, Marty, before I start to take us into the home stretch here? Are there any things that you wish I would have asked or that you'd really like to talk about?
No, I think you've given everybody a good flavor of what the book's about, and each of the chapters could be a book in itself. The chapters end with a way for you to begin to think about yourself, some questions, and then some action items to try to do. So it's not a quote self-help book in the broadest sense, but there's some of that in there. It's a book to get you thinking about yourself. And just a little bit of a plug. I realized that I wanted a psychological test to take people further. There is a bit of a catch 22. If it's a blind spot, how can you recognize it? So we have a test. It's called, and there's a QR code at the end of the book that give you access to it. You can also find it on blindspotting.com.
Blindspotting.com. So I do want to end there before I go into the home stretch with this question. As you said, in each chapter there are some things to help you think about that. But if people were here and they wanted a general idea or two about, hey, I now know I have blind spots. How do I see them and address them? What are a couple of activities or actions people might take?
Yeah, first off, I think coaching is about small tweaks. If you think about coaching, comes from athletics. And what do coaches do after somebody is a pretty good athlete? It's just small changes. So that's what we're about here. The awareness is the hard part, getting aware. And then it's being very disciplined about a small things you can do that can create a different behavior that's different than your normal one. So if you are too talkative, in meetings, you just have a stopwatch. You have somebody, give you a raise of a finger or a thumb or something telling you, hey, you're talking too much. So find those little quick things, that you can do. Go into the interaction that you're thinking of. I want to practice my new behavior. So you got the awareness triggered, and then look for the small little changes you can make. And then it's just repeating that, just like your athletic coach would have you do.
It's called practice, everybody. A couple of things before we go. Marty, I'd like to know what you're reading. We all know what you want us to be reading right now, but what are you reading these days?
So it's probably not a surprise that as a psychologist, I tend to read biographies a lot. So actually, it's a big one that's sitting on my desk is the new Ron Chernow book on Mark Twain, who's just a fascinating character. And I read books with my kind of self-awareness model in my head. So I'm thinking about, what was Mark Twain's makeup?
Awesome. So the new book about Mark Twain by Ron Chernow, that will be in the show notes, as will be Martin Dubin's new book, Blind Spotting: I'll make sure you get the subtitle right. How to see what's holding you back as a leader. Where can we learn more? And where do you want to point us? Martin, you already mentioned blindspotting.com. Any place else you want to point us? Where do you want to send us on our journey and getting connected with you?
Please buy the book at all the places that you buy books. And yeah, blindspotting.com. We have a lot of content on there. In addition, I've other talks that I've given and other content, things I've written are on blindspotting.com.
Blindspotting.com. Also, martindubin.com, I believe.
Yes.
Is also correct as well. So before we go, I want to ask the question to you as an audience, the question that I try to ask every single time we're together. And it is a simple 2-word question, but it's a powerful 2-word question. Now what? What will you do with this information? What action will you take? Maybe you're going to go get the book. Maybe you want to get the book so you can get the QR codes, so you can do the assessment. Maybe there's something that you heard about small tweaks. Maybe it's the idea of I need to be thinking about a 360. And as Martin said, there are a variety of ways to go about doing that. I don't know what your action is from this, and I don't presume to tell you, other than to say that if you want this to have been a better use of your time than just listening, it would be to act on what you heard. And I hope that you do that. If you do, this will be a far more effective use of your time. Marty, thanks for being here. It was a pleasure to have you. Ever since I got this book and decided to have you on, I've been waiting for the chance to read it, to get ready for our conversation. And it was worth the wait.
Well, thank you. And one thing to leave you with, I'm a Boilermaker too. I know that was a big part of who you
my
are.
word, everybody. Now, everybody, Marty will be back for another episode when we're going to talk about Purdue basketball. I'm just teasing. Listen, thank you, Marty, for being here. Thank you all for listening. It was a pleasure to have you here, even though you weren't with Marty and I live. And so I hope that you found it valuable, and I hope you come back, because next week we'll be back with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, and I hope you'll be back with us too.